Aloha, bienvenue Madagascar. My name is Kat Culbertson, and I'm a first-year PhD student at UC Berkeley in the POTS and Razafindratsima labs. Thanks for joining virtually today for my presentation entitled The Eco-Evolutionary History of Madagascar Presents Unique Challenges to Tropical Forest Restoration, which is based on a review that has been accepted and will soon be published at Biotropica. My research centers around forest restoration and regeneration in Madagascar. As a Peace Corps volunteer a few years ago, my imagination was captured by the idea of turning a landscape like this, near the village where I served, to one rich again in biodiversity and ecosystem services. Tree planting projects are increasingly capturing the imagination of others, too, with goals of both carbon offsets and biodiversity conservation across the planet. However, planting trees doesn't equate to growing a forest, and many knowledge gaps still exist in understanding how to execute a successful, sustainable forest restoration project, which must both conserve biodiversity and improve livelihoods and store carbon along the way. Let's take a moment to set the scene here in Madagascar. This large island off the east coast of Africa is a notable biodiversity hotspot. It has been isolated from other landmasses for over 80 million years, which has generated a unique eco-evolutionary trajectory and especially high levels of endemism, even at high taxonomic levels. Madagascar's evolutionary isolation has shaped not only species diversity and endemism, but also unique plant-animal mutualisms that shape forest regeneration. Additionally, the geography of Madagascar has led to very high levels of microendemism, which both increases vulnerability to habitat destruction and could create challenges for restoration. In addition to being a biodiversity hotspot, Madagascar has been more recently named a restoration hotspot. While the exact historical extent of forest is unclear, we do know that Madagascar has suffered high levels of deforestation over the past 70 years. With nearly 50% of forest cover in 1953 having since been lost, mostly driven by increasing need for fuel wood and land for cultivation. This figure shows forest change since 1973, and the zoomed-in piece demonstrates both extensive forest loss along with extensive fragmentation of remaining forest. Models predict that with continued deforestation and climate change, up to 93% of existing forest could be lost by 2070. All this spells out a pressing need for restoration, but many practitioners and researchers have anecdotally reported that forest restoration is quite challenging in Madagascar, potentially more challenging than in other similar biogeographical regions. The unique eco-evolutionary history of Madagascar that I've discussed on the previous slide suggests that this claim could indeed be warranted from an ecological perspective. Thus, this project. For this project, we focused on ecological, biological considerations affecting forest regeneration, investigating whether the same factors resulting in Madagascar's unique endemic biodiversity might create unique challenges to forest restoration. We conducted a literature review on peer-reviewed publications in both English and French languages, extracting quantitative data on biomass accumulation and sapling growth and survival, as well as qualitative information to address the following questions. First, does current data suggest that forest restoration in Madagascar is more challenging than in other tropical regions? And secondly, what are the primary biological and ecological challenges to forest restoration in Madagascar? We hypothesized that 4 primary factors affect Madagascar more strongly than other regions, interrupting the trajectory from deforested and degraded land to old-growth forest, due to the evolutionary isolation and unique mutualisms in Madagascar. First, there may be a pronounced lack of resilience to fire and shifting cultivation. Second, conservative growth strategies evolved due to Madagascar's heavily weathered, nutrient-poor soils may result in slow biomass recovery and enhanced vulnerability to competition. Third, especially invasive species may be of particular importance in disturbed habitats due to Madagascar's evolutionary isolation. And lastly, a lack of animal dispersers due to the unique dependence of Malagasy endemic trees on extinct or endangered forest-bound primates where seed dispersal may inhibit regeneration. Here, we display the coordinates of each unique location included in our studies reviewed. We divided Madagascar into 3 distinct regions for the study by precipitation and elevation. First, the dry forest of the west, represented in this map of Madagascar by orange, the rainforest of the east, represented in dark green, and the central subhumid highland forest in light green. Of course, much additional variability occurs within these regions, and I want to note again that not all of Madagascar was historically forested, and the exact extent is still debated, especially in the central highland region. Here's a brief summary of the literature we reviewed. For more information, you can see our forthcoming publication, but I'll highlight a few things here. Out of the 73 studies that qualified in our review, we found that rainforests were the region that was most commonly studied. We found that relatively few studies report quantitative data on biomass accumulation or sapling growth, and that the strongest evidence for restoration challenges so far has been tied to fire and shifting cultivation. Few studies, in contrast, exist on invasive species, and few studies of dispersers actually occur in regeneration areas specifically. Also, few of these studies overall demonstrate rigorous experimental designs, limiting our ability to tease apart interactive effects between our 4 hypotheses. Moving to the subset of papers reviewed reporting quantitative data, our results indicate that above-ground biomass recovery of Malagasy forests appears slower than other tropical forests, and that recovery of species diversity in regenerating areas is additionally stalled. These biomass accumulation curves were generated from data extracted from reviewed studies in Madagascar, as well as data from other tropical regions from Patton et al.'s 2020 review Global Biomass Accumulation and Carbon. Curves generated for each region are shown in the legend, and as you can see, the curve for Madagascar is much lower than other regions, especially for rainforests. This difference is statistically significant for Madagascar compared to all other rainforest regions included, as well as between neotropical dry forest and Malagasy dry forest. The slow regeneration may lead to greater restoration challenges and suggest a greater need for assisted regeneration in Madagascar than other climatically similar places. In addition to absolute biomass values, published studies demonstrate recovery ratios in Madagascar much lower than in the neotropics, indicating that naturally regenerating forests in Madagascar aren't on track to recover biomass levels of previous forests. The baseline data for comparison in this case comes from a 2016 study of biomass resilience in the neotropics by Porter et al. 2016. This supports many anecdotal suggestions of arrested succession occurring in Madagascar's forest landscapes. However, baseline data wasn't included in most studies. And Malagasy data here only came from 2 publications, so rigorous comparisons should be a priority for future research. Note also that the timelines for studies in Madagascar are shorter than in other regions. Now I'll move to the data reported on sapling survival and growth. Only a handful of studies report such data for native Malagasy species. The N here is the number of species represented. The total studies was 9. Few species are represented in statistics on growth rates as well. I want to note that there is a very short time span of study for most of these studies of less than 2 years. Additionally, a wide range of survival was shown by species, but I also want to caution interpretation of the survival stats between regions due to differences in maintenance between experiments, including shading, watering, weeding, and whatnot. Standardization of methods and/or reporting would be extremely valuable in future experiments. Also, briefly, 2 studies included growth rates of native rainforest species alongside introduced fruit and timber species, demonstrating much slower growth rates for native species than exotics, shown here, especially fast-growing exotic pioneers such as eucalyptus and acacia. Another study demonstrated slow growth rates of Acacia magnum, an exotic species, as compared to the same species grown in Ivory Coast and Borneo, with those in Madagascar reaching half the height after 19 months. And A. mangium is not native to any of these 3 locations. That leads us to the conclusion of this presentation. As I've noted, recognition of need for reforestation is rapidly growing, but little is known about how to effectively restore forest and assist natural succession through identifying and combating barriers to restoration and regeneration, especially in Madagascar's unique landscapes. Research is urgently needed to do this across Madagascar. Currently published data suggests that slow recovery is occurring in Malagasy forest, likely due to interactive effects of the hypotheses mentioned in this presentation, but a comprehensive assessment of major barriers to restoration is not possible with current data. In Madagascar, little information on cultivation of native trees is available or translatable from other regions due to high levels of endemicity, and this information is necessary to establish successful restoration. Longer-term studies are especially needed, and future studies should work to incorporate baseline values and standardized methodologies to better understand and apply findings on restoration. The role of exotic species in succession and landscape restoration is especially relevant in Madagascar, where many rural communities rely on exotic species for fuel and food, yet native species may be more inherently vulnerable to competition with these exotics than in other areas. To ensure researchers address the most relevant, timely questions, and that research is effectively incorporated into future restoration efforts, it is also vital that researchers and practitioners of reforestation work closely together. I want to briefly thank our funders, including a Bridge Collaborative Spark Award and NSF Graduate Research Fellowship. Here's the citation for our forthcoming publication, and please reach out with questions if you have any.